Looks like it's time to make another video. I wonder what this one should be about. Maybe Gojo, Boruto, old reliable. It's obviously gotta be something relevant and popular, so... I know. Let's see what everyone else is doing, because clearly that's a good idea. Not like the internet's ever been wrong before. It's not worth it, Tuck. It's not the hill worth dying on. Clearly, I just need to sleep on it and take some time to make a logical, well-thought-out, well-reasoned... You know what? Fine. You tell him I'm coming and whole cake's coming with me. Do you believe One Piece power scaling is broken? Do you believe in the myth of Katakuri? And do you believe this billionberry man is nothing more than a Bagua victim? Well then buckle up. Because I don't. And clearly having a different opinion on the internet means war must ensue. So if you're with me and believe that something just feels wrong about all this flagrant slander of a character who Oda himself so clearly built up to be a nearly unbeatable man, then you've come to the right place. Because I'm about to arm you with every bit of knowledge you will ever need to combat the allegations for One Piece's most underrated character. And maybe you can attempt to debunk some of the more absurd claims made about his strength along the way. All in an attempt to find out how strong is Katakuri actually. Now I won't lie, because we've got a lot of ground to cover with hundreds of chapters worth of narrative and feats occurring since the last time we laid eyes on the iconic donut muncher within the main continuity. I think for the sake of brevity I'd like to actually address a lot of the major arguments against Katakuri before actually getting into his lore and scaling within the world of One Piece. And I'd say the most underlying theme amongst all the Katakuri slander going around as of late is that Katakuri has been power crept by some form of lazy writing on the part of Oda. Now, while anecdotally I personally think that the story of One Piece is more internally consistent than most of the shonens I've ever seen, I can see how things such as the idea of a base rooftop Luffy and all the other supernovas being able to hurt Kaido, whereas a start of Wano Gear 4 Luffy seemingly just got one shot, isn't the best look for Katakuri, even ignoring ulti possibly hurting a base raid Luffy on the way to the rooftop. So let's start out here from the bottom, with the most realistic arguments, and work our way up to the concept of Katakuri potentially being able to hang with these Roof Beast characters. And I'd say the most efficient and powerful line of scaling at the fingertips of any Katakuri enjoyer that factually wishes to disprove the idea of Ulti versus Katakuri being any kind of a matchup, or especially this newly deranged idea of Katakuri below Chopper, should be the place where we start. Since, of all the Big Mom pirates who played any sort of major role in the Wano arc, short of Lin herself, one clearly stands out for his performance as a key player in multiple major battles. And this pirate would be Perospero. Now, I can understand why you'd probably have forgotten about some of Perospero's greater showings during the Wano arc, since he was dramatically overshadowed by stronger characters like the Yonko and Commanders, but straight up, Peros is shown to be more than capable of going toe-to-toe with one of the 9 red scabbards, and would have undoubtedly beaten him if Cat Viper was not given back free access to his Sulong form. And this is even backed up on multiple occasions because Peros is directly paralleled with Jack, even in his defeat in the very end of the arc, highly implying some level of relativity between the two fighters, as two rivals are even the people Oda decided to make beat them, without ever mentioning anything else Peros has accomplished in the arc, like being able to damage Marco, or hurt that fabled god Chop. So if it's simple enough to say Perospero can rival some of the scabbards, the new question becomes how strong are they? And while all obviously not exactly equal, the scabbards do clearly show some level of relativity with one another on the rooftop, with Jack from before even stating that any of the 9 red scabbards, which would include even a one-armed injured Kiku, are too much for any of the Tobiropo to handle in the slightest. Because of his position as a lead performer that Kaido actually believes in, there's no reason at all to doubt this opinion here. And feats also back up the notion as well, since X-Drake, even with Apu's help, struggled to beat a single CP0 agent, whereas an injured Izo could easily take down more than one in a straight fight. Knowing all this, it should be very clear that if Peros can beat base Cat Viper and potentially fight with Jack, if you actually begin to look at the overall Big Mom meritocracy and her 3 sweet generals, who are all stated numerous times to be stronger than Peros, it becomes very clear that due to simple logic of Cracker being at least on par with Jack, via upscaling from Perospero and Smoothie being above them, that Kot should dramatically outscale all of that, meaning that Katakuri is bodying Ulti and any member of the Tobiropo, as well as any non-hockey using Straw Hat. And just by proving that Jack, someone who Kaido thinks very highly of as a lead performer, is equal to or less than Cracker, you can likely also make the possible assumption that their second and third commanders should also follow suit to some extent, with this notion even being backed up a bit by Marco and King being somewhat close as first commanders. But of course, with the more basic scale on your mind now, just to show you that it's not entirely inconsistent for Big Mom's pirates to still be somewhat relevant threats in the modern metas of One Piece, it's probably time to address the elephant in the room, which is that many people seem to think base Rooftop Luffy is somehow infinitely stronger now than his Whole Cake Island counterpart, to the point where that even Ulti being able to make him struggle, even just a little bit, means she and everyone else somehow crap on Katakuri. So it's going to take a second to fully explain this and its importance, practically a little half-inception video here, but bear with me, since we're going to basically have to go over a whole mini-scale regarding the strengths and abilities of these two forms, before I can actually explain why Ulti being a mild annoyance isn't really as big of a deal as you might think it is. Now, the biggest piece of evidence that supports the idea of Luffy getting massively stronger than his old prime in base comes from the comparison we just talked about. During their first fight, Kaido one-shot Bounce Man Luffy, and in their rematch during Chapter 1001, Luffy is obviously not one-shot by a similar Thunder Bagua. But for some reason, it's almost collectively as if everyone suddenly forgot how to read during this chapter, as Oda specifically goes out of his way to drop two very clear hints as to why this happened, and even goes out of his way to add an additional piece of dialogue to remind us of this. The first thing Oda tells us after Luffy, quote-unquote, tanked this second Thunder Bagua, "Very good boy, you won't let the same one hit you head-on twice," letting us know that the first time this attack collided head-on, both physically by Kaido's Kanabo and directly by its advanced Conqueror's coating, explaining the insane level of damage that actually occurred in this scene as opposed to the second version where Luffy is merely tagged by the Conqueror's coating energy, which as Kaido implies is less effective. This goes on to be further backed up by the second thing Oda tells us as well, where Luffy says, "Dang it, I was reading the future and everything. It's so fast." What this could suggest is that before, Luffy was not using his future sight during their very first encounter, as why else would he specifically point out that he was trying it this time? And while you might think it's just headcanon nonsense to assume Luffy wouldn't use his newly awakened haki in their first match against an emperor, Katakuri made a very specific point to note back then that states of distress can weaken all kinds of haki, but specifically future sight, to the point of losing the ability temporarily when not calm. And in this first fight, Luffy literally believed Kaido had incinerated his whole crew, so he was clearly not in the right mindset to be evading a Thunder Bagua. I understand though if you think the dodging argument seems a little sketch though, but what is very clearly blatant is Zoro's statement immediately after this second Thunder Bagua, where Luffy gets distracted by Zoro using Kinemon's Foxfire style, and Zoro has to go out of his way to remind Luffy to, in his own words, not lose focus for a single instant. These two are Emperors of the Sea. And when we cut back to Luffy, we can see that he's about to get bopped by Kaido just like during their first fight, before having to be saved by Law, since he can't react in time. Now, I'm not saying that Gear 4 Luffy from Whole Cake is stronger than Roof Luffy, that would be silly, as Oda clearly presented the obvious parallels in paneling and showings to tell us how strong Luffy had gotten since their last fight. However, by the same token, I believe all three of these lines of dialogue, be it in reference to Luffy avoiding most of the one-hit KO attack, his speed barely being enough to even do so, and Zoro implying Kaido is still nearly an instant one-shot AP difference away from Luffy, are all to say that while Luffy clearly had surpassed his Gear 4's initial incarnation, he hadn't done so by leaps and bounds until much later during the fight. With this sort of precedent even being set before in the past during Katakuri's own fight, where Luffy awakens Future Sight Haki and suddenly starts performing speed feats near or on the level of his original Gear 4th incarnation from the start of the fight. Now, before you say that Luffy with Ryuo could hurt Kaido but Gear 4th Luffy couldn't, outside of the anime, which makes everything way less consistent as it's obviously sort of its own canon, Gear 4th Luffy never even hits Kaido as his advanced Conqueror's Haki kept him out of reach of Luffy's fists. And even then, comparing their actual feats, Luffy just straight up says that Ryuo plus Gear 4 is still too shallow to even damage Kaido. Hurting Kaido is a different story, as even the Scabbards, who could barely give Kaido a paper cut with their combined Ryuo attacks, were able to make him experience pain. But actually damaging Kaido meaningfully is a different story. that Gear 4 Roof Luffy doesn't even scale to, let alone base Roof Luffy. Whereas, by comparison, Gear 4 Luffy from Whole Cake was able to force Big Mom to cut her hand in Haki to block his punch, a feat that she didn't feel necessary for Jinbei, Queen, and many others, heavily implying that Big Mom was at least more threatened by him than them. In this meta, saying Luffy simply caught up to his old Gear 4 self is actually backed up more by logical and internally consistent thought processes in the world of One Piece as well, as if you look at our initial scale that said Gear 4 Luffy was on par with Katakuri, you could just as easily say that he too would upscale, being able to beat characters like Jack, and get more so into the higher commander tiers, as we all actively believed he did back when we were first reading Wano, imagining a potential fight between Luffy and Queen and Udon, or Jack and Luffy during Zou, which just makes it much less contradictory than a lot of the power cliffing arguments. And honestly, this applies to any character from any old arc in One Piece, like Punk Hazard Law somehow having enough Haki to cut Kinemon into pieces, highly implying that some of the weaker scabbards were not Dofi level, or of course, all this stuff with the rest of the Big Mom pirates who scale up to or from Parosparrow. Rather than implying all of these old characters were somehow just power cliffed by somewhat silly fan calcs, you should actually look at the way that Oda is intentionally trying to portray them, like how Luffy was considered a strong and powerful ally by the samurai long before getting Ryuo, or someone like Kuro even all the way back from East Blue being stated by Oda to have speed comparable to CP9 with his fastest attacks. Is it like super hyper consistent with no contradictions? No, but when scaling any fictional verse, consistency and author intent should clearly matter more so above any strange outliers. And honestly, all of this is just the dramatically overcomplicated way of saying that Katakuri could likely react to and combat base Ryuo Luffy, making him comparable with any number of other Roof Piece top tier characters short of the Yonko. Now of course, before I can tell you where I think Katakuri caps in his verse, we have to look at the people who still think Ulti and base Luffy are comparable, since I did say I'd look at everything. And for those folks, we'll just give it a brief mention since it's been debunked a bit more frequently than these other arguments. But as most people can see when reading this, like 2-page tussle, Luffy and everyone else involved with the raid is trying their very best to make a mad rush for the roof, to help the very underpowered scabbards who can't even give a paper cut to Kaido with their team attack. And in Ulti's case, she gets in Luffy's way while he's on the move, and rather than trying to fight her back, wasting time, Luffy directly tanks the full power of her Ulti Mortar, a named attack, using nothing more than his face, and he gets knocked back a little bit before literally saying that he was just underestimating her strength too much, and proceeds to immediately perception blitz her, grab her horns, and toss her through the building, which is quickly followed up by him Gear 3rd punching Page 1 into a near knockout. So even a slightly serious Luffy not using Ryuo or his other amps could quickly handle 2 members of the Tobiropo, only being even slightly pressed against a full beast form Ulti who had completely gripped him, and realizing he'd waste time trying to beat through their tough hides in base, he just decides to skip to Gear 4 to end things quickly, before a base shackled Yamato manages to knock down Ulti in one strike. Keep in mind, Sea Prism Stones nerf Haki and Devil Fruit abilities to a drastic extent, yet even this base Yamato, who is at most portrayed as relative to Ace in the anime, putting her in the commander tiers of power, was more than capable of quickly dispatching Ulti in a single hit. With all this said, plus Jack's statements about the Tobiropo being even less powerful than the Scabbards, Luffy blitzing Ulti and shackled Yamato taking her down in one quick move, it should be very clear that Ulti doesn't in any way really scale to Luffy, with her not even being strong enough to take out the weaker Straw Hats like Nami and Usopp, even after hitting them with multiple of her headbutts. But with 2 very different, somewhat overlapping power scaling metas presented here, that both promote the idea of Katakuri at least being some sort of threat to these 1-0 tier characters, I'd like to wrap this video up with the most important part of any Interverse power scaling video, the lore of the character, to explain how and why he can match up with certain other characters within the verse. Because from even his earliest days, Katakuri was known as undefeatable, a man whose back had never touched the ground once. Not as a child, not as he slept, and not as a pirate fighting through the eras of Rocks, Roger, and Whitebeard, shoulder to shoulder with Emperors of the Sea at every turn of his life. This legacy was so important to Katakuri that he would literally rather try to break his neck to stop his fall than to even consider landing on his back while not even in the presence of others. And with Oda confirming the whole sleep while standing up thing kind of humorously in an SBS, the legacy and hype built up around Katakuri as the strongest Charlotte sibling is not just one that should be believed, but one that Oda intentionally built up with such dramatic tension because of Katakuri's role as a dark mirror of Luffy himself. By comparison, even Kaido, the king of the beasts who could not be slain by any weapon on heaven or earth, had still tasted defeat to the tune of 7 times in his long, storied career. Yet, up until his battle with Luffy, the soon-to-be reincarnation of Joy Boy, Oda made it very clear that no one, narratively speaking, could beat Katakuri besides Luffy, despite living for only around a decade less than the previously mentioned Kaido. And even after a marathon fight with multiple advantages given to Luffy, such as multiple uses of Gear 4 presented by Brûlé being a hostage and a newly awakened form of Haki, the way which Oda decided to end Katakuri vs. Luffy was not by Katakuri being overwhelmed or defeated in the actual heat of battle like Kaido, Crocodile, or Doflamingo. No, by the end of the fight, Katakuri is nothing more than a single punch away from ending the life of our Haki-less, straw hat-wearing protagonist, after successfully evading and beating down his newly revealed Snake Man transformation. Yet, rather than doing that, he asks him if he'd come back and defeat Big Mom. And after learning that he sincerely would, Katakuri understood that there was no reason to fight anymore. Then Luffy beat the unbeatable man, not by way of power, but by proving his will and his dream was the superior one. This is all significant because Kot is not just peerless among his crew, standing head and shoulders above everyone but Big Mom herself, but as his fight with Luffy also showed us all at the time, his willpower was just as critical of a piece as his skill or his strength, to making him truly the insurmountable wall that Luffy and almost anyone on his level would have to overcome, to truly beat that which was unbeatable. And in the story of One Piece, this makes him a character of undoubtedly high standing, as willpower means everything here. It's quite literally the source of all Haki, hence why he's only one of 3 first commanders known to have this ability. And you couple that with Katakuri's level of skill, which he developed as a way of supporting this unbeatable man narrative, mastering his devil fruit to the point of awakening, a feat which no other commander has been shown to replicate, as well as being one of the few commanders that confirmed to have an advanced form of Haki at all, which Kaido points out is the most important factor to conquering the seas. This lore Oda presented to back Katakuri up as one of the most well-versed and capable combatants in the entire series, with a similar grind set to Luffy, is, as I've hopefully shown you at this point, not really conducive at all with the narrative that people like Nami, Chopper, the Tobiropo, and any other non-top tier really is getting anywhere close to his undefeatable status. And really, by just stopping and thinking about it for a second, knowing what we do about the Emperor's volatility towards each other and seeing how people like even Whitebeard and Roger interacted when crossing paths, Katakuri's title and hype in all likelihood should at the very least apply to the other Yonko commanders, as why else would someone in his position be seen in such a light? You couple all of the narrative implications of Katakuri being unbeatable with his future sight and Conqueror's Haki, plus his awakened Luffy paralleling Devil Fruit, on top of the scaling chains I've already shown you, clearly showing that Oda himself still intends for weaker Big Mom pirates like Sparrow to be comparable to the Scabbards and Jack, making stronger ones like Cracker, Smoothie, and Cot clearly scaled into those upper commander tiers, as well as the support from the notion of base Rooftop Luffy being clearly more so comparable to that initial Gear 4 Snake Man, who Katakuri could rival if not blatantly overpower at the end of their fight, rather than power cliffing it massively. And, well, I hope all of that is enough to at least silence a fraction of the obscene Katakuri downplay that goes on in this community. He's not losing to Ulti, he's not losing to Queen, and he is most definitely not losing to Chopper. In all likelihood, he deserves to be seen in the same weight class as the other first commander tier characters, with his lore potentially implying that even among them, he's one of the strongest. This video was all in good fun though, so don't take it too personally if you're amongst the Katakuri-hating heathens. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, debunking the notions of underpowered characters from other animes, or even someone else from One Piece, like the Heavenly Demon, just hit that big red button to summon forth another pseudo-debunk-esque video like this one again. And with that all out of the way, that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.